Ruthless Mafia. Fear ruthless by everyone, feared by everyone, untouched.
The first time he saw her, he was dying, though he didn't know it yet. Blood slicked the hospital floor, the scent of antiseptic barely masking the coppery tang of his own body. He had always been the one, in control, powerful, feared, untouchable, but at that moment, sprawled on a stretcher with sirens echoing outside, he was nothing. Nothing but fragile skin stretched over broken bones, and he hated it. Her hands moved like quiet thunder, precise and unhesitating as she inserted the 4 with a calm he couldn't begin to understand. She didn't flinch at the sight of him, at the chaos that clung to him like a second skin. Most people flinched. Most people screamed. She didn't. Her eyes, deep brown and warm, met his with a steadiness that made his chest tighten in ways he wasn't used to. "Stay with me," she said, voice soft but firm, almost a whisper. "You're not leaving me today." He wanted to laugh, bitterly, because no one had ever cared enough to say that. People feared him, yes, people obeyed him, but no one had ever pleaded with him to live. She didn't know him, and yet some instinct, some invisible thread made her fight for him like he was the only person in the world who mattered. The ambulance had dropped him off just moments ago, a bullet still lodged near his shoulder. Blood seeping like time itself was bleeding out of him. He had survived ambushes before, betrayals in darkened warehouses, assassins with cold eyes and frozen hands. But this sterile room with harsh fluorescent light was different. Here, vulnerability wasn't a weapon. Here, he was powerless, and he hated it. "Hold still," she murmured as she pressed gauze against the wound. "You're gonna be okay." He wanted to argue, to tell her it wasn't okay. He wanted to warn her that being near him was dangerous, that he was dangerous. But the words stuck in his throat, caught in a strange mix of awe and confusion. The way she leaned over him, hair tied back in a simple knot, lips set in quiet determination, it was disarming. It was unbearable. And then his vision blurred, not from blood loss, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sense that anyone actually wanted him alive. He hadn't felt that in years, maybe never. "You're slipping," she said, voice tightening slightly, and he felt a shiver of fear he didn't recognize. "Stay with me. Just stay with me." He tried to respond, to reassure her that he could handle it, but his mouth was dry, tongue thick, thoughts scattered like ash. He realized, with a strange clarity, that he couldn't handle it. Not this time. She had to lead. She had to save him. And somehow, in the most humiliating way imaginable for a man like him, he wanted her to. Minutes stretched into eternity. His mind, usually sharp as a blade, felt dull, fractured, unworthy of the life that still pulsed stubbornly through him. He wanted to hate her for seeing him like this, for breaking through the armor he had spent decades building. But he couldn't. He only watched, helpless, as she worked, as she moved with precision, a quiet rhythm that kept him tethered to the world. When the bleeding finally slowed, when the 4 was secure and the monitors beeped in steady rhythm, he tried to sit up, to regain even a sliver of the control he'd always wielded like a crown. But she placed a firm hand on his chest, and the command in her eyes stopped him cold. "Don't. You're not in charge here," she said, and her tone carried no disrespect, only certainty. Something inside him broke then, not the physical wounds, but the walls he had built so meticulously over 30 years of fear, power, and solitude. He wanted to argue, but his pride, for once, felt ridiculous. There was no shame in letting someone care for you, he realized. Pain, vulnerability, it wasn't weakness when she held your hand through it. It was life. And when he finally looked at her properly, really looked, he noticed the faint lines around her eyes, the weariness she carried not from indifference but from sacrifice. She was strong, but not untouchable. She was human. And he, for the first time in decades, felt fragile, like a man who had been told he could live and had no choice but to believe it. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words felt foreign on his tongue. He didn't usually speak like this. He didn't usually speak at all. But she made him want to speak, to connect, to acknowledge the debt he would never forget. Her gaze softened for the briefest instant, almost a tremor, before she straightened. "You'll be fine. Just don't scare me like that again." He wanted to laugh, but all that came out was a hoarse rasp. He watched her leave the room to check on other patients, and for a fleeting moment, he thought about stopping her, calling her back, telling her he couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something purely for him, without expectation, without fear. But he didn't. He waited. And in that waiting, something unexpected happened. A seed planted in the sterile glow of the hospital, tiny but undeniable, took root. He didn't know it yet, but it would change everything. Because for the first time, in a life built on fear and dominance, he felt something unfamiliar, hope. And hope, he realized with a shiver, was terrifying. The city had a way of swallowing people whole, even the powerful, and he knew it better than anyone. But lying in that hospital bed, the pulse of life slowing and surging with each heartbeat, he felt the world differently. The corridors outside were noisy with the ordinary chaos of medicine, but inside everything narrowed to her hands, her voice, the way she moved with quiet authority over a place that might as well have been a battlefield. He tried to leave the next morning. Habit, pride, the instinct control. But she intercepted him before he could step past the nurse's station, arms folded, gaze unwavering. "You're not going anywhere," she said, voice low. "You nearly died. Again, you need rest." Her words, delivered like a verdict, cut deeper than any bullet he'd survived. He had spent decades commanding loyalty, fear, obedience. And here she was, standing firm without flinching, refusing to yield. His pulse quickened, and not just from injury. There was an edge to her presence, a pull he didn't understand, and yet couldn't resist. "I'm fine," he said, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. He had to mask it. Control was all he had ever known. But she didn't back down. She never did. "No, you're not," she snapped softly. And there it was again, the mix of strength and frustration that made his chest tighten. "I don't care who you are, or what you've done. You're not walking out of here until I say so." He stared at her, dark eyes cold at first, then gradually softened. Nobody spoke to him like that. Not his lieutenants, not his rivals, not even his closest allies. She didn't kowtow, didn't beg. She simply drew a line and refused to let him cross it. That night, he didn't sleep. Not fully. He lay on the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every small detail of her face, her movements, the way her hair fell when she bent over a patient. There was a rhythm to her life, a groundedness he'd never known. He had lived surrounded by men who whispered loyalty and women who whispered danger. But she whispered nothing. She simply was. The days that followed were a blur of tension and quiet observation. She checked his vitals, adjusted his bandages, made sure he ate, insisting he drink water like a child, and he found himself following her instructions without protest. It was humiliating, in a way only a man used to commanding armies could feel, and yet there was a warmth in that submission, a strange relief in surrendering control even for a moment. He began asking questions, not about her life, not about herself, he was too wary for that, but about the hospital, about procedures, about medicines. She answered, calm and patient, never condescending, and gradually he realized he was listening more than he had in years. Really listening. One evening she paused at his bedside, a soft exhale escaping her lips. "You're lucky," she said, almost to herself. "Most people in your position, they don't get a second chance." He wanted to argue, wanted to assert that luck had nothing to do with it, that it was skill, strategy, survival. But he found himself hesitating, caught off guard by the vulnerability in her tone. She wasn't talking to him as a man of power. She was talking to him as a man who had nearly died and had been given something precious, life itself. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. It wasn't just the care, it was the persistence, the refusal to let him be anything less than alive. She met his gaze, unwavering. "Because it's right," she said simply. "Because someone has to care, even if it's just for a little while, even if you think you don't deserve it." The weight of her words sank into him, and he felt a flicker of something long buried, shame, perhaps, or guilt, or maybe the first stirrings of a longing he wasn't ready to name. His life had been built on fear and respect bought with violence, yet here was a woman ordinary, unassuming, stubbornly moral, shaking the foundations of everything he believed about himself. He noticed things about her he hadn't before, the way she flinched when a child cried in the ward, the way her smile, rare but genuine, could fill a room with quiet light, the way she seemed to carry invisible weight on her shoulders, yet never let it slow her down. He realized that she was strong, not because she had no fear, but because she had chosen to keep moving anyway. One night, while he was resting, she returned with a small cup of tea. He watched her as she settled into a chair nearby, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. For a long moment, they just looked at each other in silence, the unspoken understanding stretching taut across the sterile room. I've never met anyone like you, he said finally, voice low. It wasn't a confession, it was a truth he couldn't contain. She tilted her head slightly, as though weighing his words. I don't think you want anyone like me, she replied gently. But there was a faint hint of curiosity in her tone. The tension between them was tangible, a silent dance neither of them had rehearsed. And yet, in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the distant hum, machines and the soft murmur of footsteps in the hallway, a connection began to form, a fragile thread linking a man used power and fear with a woman whose strength was quiet, human, and unwavering. But the world outside was relentless, and the calm they shared could not last forever. Shadows of his life, of the streets, of deals and vendettas, were already creeping toward them, and he knew, with a clarity that made his chest tighten, that keeping her close and safe would be harder than anything he had ever faced that night. As he watched her leave the ward, the weight of the truth pressed down on him. He was falling, fast and unexpectedly, for the woman who had saved his life. And falling for her might be the most dangerous thing he had ever done. He left the hospital the day the city felt unusually cold, the wind biting through his coat like a reminder that control had limits even for him. He had survived gunfights, betrayals, and countless nights where death hovered close, yet stepping out into the world with her memory etched into his thoughts felt like navigating a battlefield, blindfolded. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the precision in her movements, the warmth in her voice. He hated that he cared, and hated even more that he feared what it might mean. She hadn't followed him, and he was grateful for that. The last thing he wanted was to drag her into his darkness before she fully understood it. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes, the way they had held him, steady and unflinching, in the moments when life and death balanced on a knife's edge. He wondered if she even remembered him as more than another patient, or if she would ever know the depth of the storm she had calmed inside him. Back in his world, the streets whispered rumors he couldn't ignore. One of his men had been careless, too many eyes, too many ears, and someone had put a price on his head. He had survived worse, yes, but the thought of a bullet finding him now, with his thoughts tangled around her, was unnerving. She had no idea what he carried in his life, and he had no intention of ever letting her bear it. He visited the usual places, met the usual people, and yet everything felt muted. Power, once intoxicating, now felt hollow. He noticed small details, how a child's laughter in a cafe could pierce his focus, how the sight of a family walking together drew a pang he didn't recognize. His life had been built on fear, intimidation, and loyalty enforced through violence. And now, he realized he wanted something entirely different, a life that involved care, connection, and maybe, though he dared not admit it, love. Meanwhile, she worked her shifts, unaware that the man she had saved was navigating the dangerous streets she instinctively feared. Her son, little Marco, was at the center of her world, and her protective instincts were fierce. She had promised herself that no man, no matter how compelling or charming, would threaten their fragile life, and yet she couldn't erase the memory of him. There was a ghost in her mind, the faint echo of his gratitude, the intensity in his eyes, the subtle vulnerability that had flickered through the armor he wore. One evening, as she left the hospital, her son tugging at her hand, a black car idled near the street. She barely noticed at first, accustomed to the constant hum of the city. But then she caught a glimpse of him, leaning against the door, coat collar turned up, eyes scanning the street. Her heart skipped, not in fear, but in recognition. He smiled faintly, a rare, guarded curve of his lips, and tipped his head in a small, formal gesture. It wasn't the playful smile of someone courting her, it was a statement. He was here, and he was watching. She pulled Marco closer, uneasy. Something about him made her stomach twist, a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Mom, who's that?" Marco asked, eyes wide. "Just someone," she said quickly, masking the flutter of something she didn't want to name. She wasn't ready for this, and she wasn't ready for him. Not yet. But he didn't move away. He waited, silent, letting her lead, letting her choose whether to engage. And slowly, over the coming days, he began showing up in subtle ways, passing by the cafe where she had coffee with Marco, parking a few blocks away during her errands, always watching, always careful. There was no aggression, no intrusion. Only presence. And presence, she realized reluctantly, was impossible to ignore. One evening, a minor accident at the grocery store forced him to step in. A man had cornered her, too close, too menacing, and instinctively, he moved between them. His presence was commanding, unmistakable. She felt the hairs on her arms rise, her heart thumping with the thrill and fear of it. He didn't speak at first, just allowed the threat to dissolve under his silent authority. "Are you hurt?" he asked finally, voice low, controlled and impossibly intimate. "I'm fine," she said, brushing past him, but her pulse betrayed her words. She didn't want his protection. She didn't want him to be a part of their life. And yet, she couldn't deny the rush of safety, the strange, magnetic pull he exerted. For him, the incident was both terrifying and exhilarating. He had spent years maintaining a careful distance from normal lives, avoiding attachments, avoiding weakness, and now, for the first time, he couldn't pull away, couldn't dismiss the longing that simmered beneath his cold exterior. Protecting her wasn't a strategy, it was instinct, and every instinct screamed that he had to be near her, had to keep her safe, even if it destroyed him in the process. That night as he drove through the darkened streets, the city alive with neon and sirens, he thought about her, about Marco, about the impossibility of what he wanted. She was life itself, bright, unyielding, untouchable, and he was danger incarnate. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about crossing that line, about stepping into her world fully, knowing that doing so would leave scars on both of them. Meanwhile, she returned home, unsettled. She couldn't shake the image of him, powerful, dangerous, unwavering, and the memory of the hospital where he had looked at her as though she alone could save him. Something had shifted in her too, a strange curiosity, a flicker of something tender and dangerous at once. Neither of them slept well that night, both haunted by the memory of what had happened, and both aware that their worlds so utterly different, so dangerous, were beginning to collide. And deep down, they knew that once the collision happened, nothing would ever be the same, because danger was coming, and love, unpredictable, unbidden, and terrifying, was already taking root. The days blurred into nights, but for him every moment was sharp, deliberate, haunted. He could see her clearly, even when she wasn't there, the curve of her shoulder as she carried Marco's backpack, the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way she moved through life with a quiet determination he had long forgotten existed in the world. He wanted to reach out, to step into her life fully, but every instinct screamed caution. His world was darkness, and hers was light. If he touched her, he risked extinguishing it. But fate, it seemed, had no interest in patience. One evening, as she left the school where Marco attended classes, she found herself followed not closely, but unmistakably. Shadows lengthened behind her as she walked, and for the first time in months, unease pricked at her with the sharp insistence of instinct. "Marco, stay close," she whispered, hand tight on his small shoulder. The boy glanced up, curious, unaware of the subtle tension in the air. The black car appeared again, parked just down the street. She stopped, heart hammering, and froze. The door opened slowly, and he stepped out, coat collar high, expression unreadable. He didn't approach aggressively. He didn't speak. He merely stood there, as though daring her to notice him, and when she did, he gave the faintest nod, a silent acknowledgement that he had been watching, protecting, without her asking. Her breath hitched, half fear, half fascination. "What do you want?" she called out, voice sharper than she intended. "Just making sure you're safe," he said, voice calm, controlled. "That's all." She bristled, instinctively angry, though the heat in her chest betrayed her. "I don't need your protection," she snapped, scanning the street for any real danger. "I manage just fine on my own." He didn't argue, He never did. But there was an intensity in his gaze, a quiet insistence that unsettled her. He wasn't asking for permission. He was asserting a presence she could no longer ignore. Days later, an urgent call from the hospital drew her back into the fluorescent-lit halls she knew too well. One of her patients had taken a turn for the worse. She rushed through the corridors, Marco's small hand brushing against hers. And there he was again, waiting, leaning against the wall like he belonged there, though he had no right to be. "You're here a lot," she said finally, trying to mask the mix of exasperation and relief. "I'm here when I need to be," he replied, tone casual but heavy with implication. "And right now I need to make sure you're safe." Her hands shook slightly as she led Marco to a seat in the waiting area. He followed at a measured distance, nothing aggressive, nothing threatening, just a shadow. And yet, the weight of him was enough to make her pulse race, to make her question how a man so commanding, so dangerous, could exist in her ordinary, fragile world. Over the next week, their encounters multiplied quietly, subtly, deliberately. He appeared where he knew she would be, lingered when he had no reason, and every moment between them became charged with a tension neither could define. She hated herself for noticing him so easily, for feeling the pull of his presence, for realizing that safety and danger could coexist in a single glance. Then came the night that changed everything. She had just finished a long shift, fatigue dragging her muscles into rebellion, when Marco's cries shattered the stillness of their small apartment. He had fallen, scraping his knee badly, and she rushed to comfort him, trying not to panic. Before she could even reach the phone for the ambulance, a knock sounded at the door. Hesitation froze her. Opening it, she found him standing there, eyes dark and intense, coat dusted with rain, the city's neon bleeding into the edges of his silhouette. "You called me in your thoughts," he said softly, almost teasing, though the edge beneath the surface was unmistakable. "I didn't want you to be alone." She stiffened. "You have no right." "I have every right," he interrupted, voice low, almost dangerous. "Because you've become important." The word hit her harder than any bullet ever could. Important. Nobody had ever said that to her, not since the night her husband walked away, leaving her to raise Marco alone. She blinked, trying to process, but he didn't wait for her response. He stepped inside, moving past her with the certainty of someone who belonged, though she refused to let him. "Stay back," she warned, voice trembling despite herself. "Marco, get to your room." The boy hesitated, caught between fear and curiosity, and he knelt down, speaking softly, his hand brushing Marco's shoulder. "Hey, little man," he said gently. "I won't hurt you." Marco's wide eyes studied him, and then, tentatively, he nodded. The moment broke something in her, a wall she hadn't realized she had built around herself. He wasn't just dangerous, he was capable of tenderness. And tenderness in a man like him was more disarming than any weapon. They spent the night talking quietly, Marco asleep under blankets in the other room. She watched him, studied the subtle changes in his expression, the way his hands flexed and relaxed, the way he carried both weight and regret in a posture that never claimed softness except here, with them, when he let it slip. "I'm not used to this," she said finally, breaking the silence. "To anyone being this involved, especially you. I'm not used to wanting this," he admitted, voice low. "Wanting anyone." Her heart skipped. Words like that, from a man like him, were dangerous. They were reckless. But they were real. And in that moment, as rain pattered against the windows, she realized that nothing would ever be the same. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent, dangerous. Inside, a fragile connection had begun to form, one that promised both salvation and chaos, and neither of them could deny that they were drawn to it, drawn to each other, even as the shadow of his world loomed closer, threatening to destroy the life she fought so hard to protect. Because love, they would both learn, was far more perilous than bullets. The first real storm didn't come from the sky, it came from the streets. He had promised himself he would keep her out of his world, would shield her from the shadows that had followed him all his life. But promises were fragile, and the city had long since decided that her light would not go unnoticed. One evening, as she walked home from the hospital with Marco in tow, a car slowed alongside them. Men stepped out, faces hard, eyes sharp. The kind of danger she had never imagined existed so close. "Mom!" Marco cried, gripping her hand tighter. She froze, heart hammering, scanning the street for escape, only to find him already there, moving with lethal calm. He stepped between her and the men, the air around him taut with authority. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at them, eyes dark, and in that silence, the threat was already extinguished. The men hesitated, then backed down. One muttered a warning and they left. The car peeled away, leaving nothing but the echo of tires on asphalt. She stared at him, trembling. Why are you here?" Her voice wavered, caught between fear and relief. He didn't answer immediately. He simply reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering longer than necessary. "Because I can't let anything happen to you," he said finally, voice low, deliberate. "Not you, not him." Marco tugged at her sleeve, wide-eyed. "Who is he, Mom?" She swallowed hard. "Just someone who cares." But even as she said it, she knew the words were insufficient. He was more than that. He was dangerous, yes, but also the only person who had made her feel a strange sense of safety in months, maybe years. The night left her shaken. Back in their apartment, she paced, refusing to let herself think too deeply, refusing to admit that the rush of protection he gave her stirred something entirely new. Marco slept soundly, oblivious, but she couldn't. The thought of him watching, protecting, intruding refused to leave her mind. He too didn't sleep. In his penthouse overlooking the city, he replayed the encounter, noting every tremor in her voice, every flicker of fear mixed with something else, something softer, something that reached a part of him long buried. Protecting her wasn't a duty, it was instinct. And instincts, he knew, were hard to ignore. Over the next days, the tension between them grew. She found herself noticing him in small, almost unbearable ways: the curve of his jaw, the dark intensity in his gaze, the way he seemed to move through the world, as though it obeyed him. He noticed her too, though in his world, noticing was dangerous. One slip, one misread look, and everything could unravel. One afternoon, as she walked through the hospital courtyard, he appeared again. He didn't approach immediately. He stayed at a distance, shadowed by a tree, watching her interact with patients, and in that moment she saw him not as a threat, but as someone who carried his own burdens with quiet gravity. "You can't keep doing this," she said, voice firm, though her hands betrayed her by twisting the strap of her bag. Showing up, watching. "It's not safe." "I don't do safe," he replied, voice low, almost a growl. "I do what needs to be done." She wanted to argue, wanted to assert that normal life mattered, that she and Marco had a fragile routine worth protecting. But the words caught in her throat. He had a presence that made arguments feel irrelevant, as though the world bent slightly when he spoke. And then, the first real test came. A rival faction had caught wind of his movements, and in the dead of night, a hitman appeared outside her apartment. She was returning from a shift, unaware of the danger. When she noticed the black car idling nearby, heart pounding, she instinctively tried to retreat, but he was already there. The door opened, and he stepped out, eyes scanning the shadows. "Get inside," he ordered, tone sharp. No room for argument. She hesitated, and in that instant, a figure lunged from the darkness. He moved faster, intercepting the attacker with a precision that made her gasp. The man went down, groaning, and he didn't look at her as he turned, every movement calculated, every breath measured. "Are you hurt?" he asked after a tense moment, eyes finally meeting hers. "No," she whispered, trembling. "Marco, he's inside." "Good," he said, voice softer now, almost. "Careful. Stay there. Don't move until I say so." Inside, she watched from the window as he moved. A figure of quiet danger, eliminating threats before they could touch them. And in that moment, the truth she had been fighting for weeks hit her with full force. She was falling for him. The man who could destroy her world in an instant had already captured her heart. When it was over, he returned to her apartment. Dripping rain, coat damp, eyes unreadable. She wanted to scold him, to tell him was reckless. But the words dissolved under the weight of something deeper. She could feel it now, the pull between them, undeniable, dangerous, irresistible. "You can't keep doing this," she said finally, voice low, almost a plea. "I can't stop," he admitted, tone quiet but intense. "Not anymore." For the first time, they were both honest. Fear, desire, need all tangled in a silent truth neither could ignore. She looked at him, and for the first time, really saw him not the Mafia boss, not the dangerous stranger, but the man who had survived countless battles and still felt human. And he saw her, not as a nurse, not as a woman to protect, but as someone who had changed him, softened. The edges of a life built on fear made him feel something he thought was impossible: hope. Outside, the city hummed indifferent. Inside, their worlds had collided, violently and irreversibly, and as the rain poured down, blurring the lights of the streets, neither of them could deny the truth. The life they had known was over. What came next would be beautiful, terrifying, and inevitable, because love, when it came from a Mafia boss and a nurse, was never gentle. It was always dangerous. The next morning, the city felt heavier, almost complicit in the danger that had brushed so close the night before. She woke to sunlight, slicing through her blinds, but it did nothing to lighten the weight pressing on her chest. Marco slept in the next room, and she could hear his soft breaths, innocent and unaware, and it almost made her heart break. She had promised herself he would grow up safe, untouched by the darkness she had spent years shielding him from. And yet, now, that darkness had a name. She found him waiting outside when she stepped into the courtyard. His presence was immediate, commanding, as if the world subtly bent around him. She hated that it made her pulse race. She hated that she wanted to look at him longer than necessary. She hated that he made her feel seen in a way nobody else had. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice quiet, almost hesitant, though the power in his stance never wavered. She began, but stopped herself. Words felt inadequate. What could she say? That she was terrified of him and fascinated by him at the same time. That she hated how safe she felt when he was near. That she was beginning to fall for the man who could destroy them all with a single decision. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. She wanted to tell him to go, to return to his empire of shadows, to leave her life untouched. But she couldn't. She needed to understand him, to understand the pull he had on her heart, and so she followed him, silently, as he led her to a place she had never imagined she'd see, the inner workings of his world. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't cinematic. It was raw, efficient, and terrifying. Men moved through the rooms with practiced precision, phones clutched in tight hands, eyes constantly scanning, papers shuffled, money counted, eyes shifted, and in the center of it all, he was calm, immovable, a force of nature that everyone else circled like planets around a sun. She watched him and realized, in that moment, just how much he carried. Every decision, every threat, every betrayal, it all fell on him. And yet, he still cared for her. He had saved her, protected her, and he hadn't asked for anything in return. Not money, not loyalty, not love. He had done it purely because it was what he chose to do. For the first time, she understood that his power wasn't just in fear, it was in the choice to wield it, in the weight of responsibility he bore silently, invisibly. "You see this, and you think it's all about control, don't you?" he asked suddenly, voice low, breaking the spell of her observation. Maybe," she admitted cautiously, unsure how much she should say. "It's not," he continued. "It's about survival. It's about keeping people alive even when they don't know I'm saving them. Even when it kills me inside to do the things I have to." She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the cracks beneath the surface, the rare vulnerability he allowed himself, just for her. And it terrified her, because the more she understood him, the more impossible it became to walk away. That night, she returned home, Marco asleep, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the city beyond the walls, and she realized, with a painful clarity, that her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a mother protecting her son. She was a woman entangled in the life of a man whose shadows threatened to swallow everything she held dear. And yet, she couldn't hate him. She didn't want to. Days turned into weeks. He continued to appear in her life, with the subtlety of someone testing boundaries, sometimes a shadow in the distance, sometimes a presence at her side. Marco began to trust him slowly, drawn to the warmth and care he rarely showed anyone. And she, despite herself, began to notice the small things, the way he flinched at loud noises, the faint tremor in his hands when he thought no one was looking, the rare moments of tenderness he allowed when he thought she wasn't watching. But trust wasn't simple. Every encounter reminded her that his world was dangerous, that one wrong step could destroy them all. And yet, with every glance, every shared smile, she found herself drawn closer. Then came the moment that made everything impossible to ignore. A rival gang, the same faction that had tried to threaten her before, struck at one of his operations. It wasn't a full-scale attack, but enough to remind everyone involved that danger was never far behind. He called her that night, voice low and steady. "I need you to stay inside. Lock the doors. Do not leave. Marco's with you, I know, but if anything happens, I can't promise." "Promise what?" she asked sharply, cutting him off. Her hands gripped the phone like it was a lifeline. "Nothing," he said, the word heavy with unspoken meaning. "Just stay safe, please." The vulnerability in his voice, the rare, unguarded honesty made her stomach twist. For the first time, she realized the depth of his feelings and the impossible position she was in. This man, powerful and dangerous beyond measure, was entrusting her with something he never gave anyone, the truth of his concern, his care, his heart. She obeyed, locking the doors, sitting with Marco in the quiet apartment, her thoughts racing. She wanted to run to him, to be near him, to step into his world despite everything. But she also feared it, feared the consequences, feared losing herself, feared that the man who had saved her life could also destroy it. And in the darkness, as the city's neon glow seeped through the blinds, she realized that her heart had already chosen. She loved him, and he somewhere out there was loving her in a way that could consume them both. The night the attack came, the city's pulse felt different, sharper, faster, alive with menace. She sat in her apartment, Marco curled against her side, eyes wide with fear she tried to mask. Every creak of the floor, every distant siren made her flinch, made her pulse spike. She had known danger in the abstract before, but never so immediate, never so personal. And then his voice came over the phone, calm, precise, commanding, yet threaded with a rare, raw tension. "Stay inside. Do not open the door for anyone. Marco stays with you." "Understood." "Yes," she whispered, almost trembling, "but what's happening?" "Nothing you can fix. That's my job." His words, though reassuring, carried weight, the gravity of a man who had spent his life keeping others alive while carrying death in his own hands. The first crash came minutes later. A car slammed into the building across the street, shattering glass, sending tremors through the floor beneath her. Marco clung to her, crying softly. She felt paralyzed, torn between fear and the instinct to flee. But then she heard the muted sounds outside, the soft, controlled movements of men trained to fight, to kill, to survive, and she knew he was there. Hours passed. Explosions, shouts, the city's chaos pressing in from every window. She stayed put, holding Marco, whispering words of comfort she barely felt herself. And all the while, she imagined him out there stepping into danger for her son, for people who would never understand the weight he bore. When the chaos finally subsided, she didn't breathe immediately. The silence was deafening, heavy with aftermath. Then the door opened, not violently, not carelessly, but with a deliberate gentleness that made her heart nearly stop. He stood there, coat damp, eyes dark, hands bloodied, yet alive. Alive. And the sight of him, standing in her small apartment like a storm that had passed yet left devastation behind, made her realize just how deeply she had fallen for him. "You're safe," he said softly, scanning the room. "I made sure of it." I thought," she began, but words failed. Fear, relief, admiration, and longing tangled together, and she couldn't untangle them fast enough. He stepped closer, the air between them charged, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the pull of everything. She had tried to resist the danger, the desire, the undeniable connection that had grown despite her best efforts. "I can't lose you," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. "I can't lose him either." He nodded toward Marco, then back to her. "You're my world now, even if you don't see it." Her chest tightened. "You're dangerous," she whispered. "Everything about you, it could ruin us. I know, he said, the confession heavy raw. And I'm willing to risk it. For you. For him. For us. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she reached out, trembling, and brushed a hand against his chest. For the first time, he didn't resist. He leaned into her touch, the armor of the Mafia boss slipping just enough to reveal the man underneath the man who had been shaped by violence but softened by her presence. They stayed like that for a long moment, suspended between fear and relief, between past wounds and fragile hope. And when Marco stirred, blinking awake, she realized something vital. He wasn't just a protector. He was becoming part of their family, whether she allowed it or not. The attack had changed everything. It had brought the darkness closer, made the stakes undeniable, but it had also stripped away pretenses, forcing them both to confront the truth of their feelings. I can't keep you in the shadows forever, she said finally, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. You can't pretend that your world and mine don't exist side by side. It's too dangerous, and one day, someone could get hurt. We need to face it together or not at all. He studied her. Eyes dark, unreadable, yet for the first time, soft. Together, he said finally, the single word carrying a lifetime of unspoken promises, regrets, and hopes. I'll face it all with you. I swear it. She nodded, heart pounding. The truth was terrifying. Yes, his world was violent, unpredictable, and inescapable. But so was her love for him. And as she looked into his eyes, she understood something crucial. Fear might define his life, danger might shape it, but love real, undeniable. Love was powerful enough to make even a Mafia boss human. The storm outside had passed, but inside, a new one had begun. It wasn't made of bullets or blood, it was made of emotion, longing, trust, and an undeniable bond neither of them could ignore. For the first time, they allowed themselves to hope. And that hope, fragile as it was, would become the anchor they clung to as the world outside continued its relentless, dangerous rhythm. Because love in their world was never quiet. It was never easy, but it was real. The days that followed were quieter, but the quiet carried a tension neither of them could shake. He had kept her safe during the attack, but the aftermath left questions that refused to settle. Every shadow outside her window, every whispered rumor in the hospital corridors, every sudden knock at the door reminded her that his word would never allow peace to linger. And yet she had begun to feel something she had never expected: trust. Tentative, fragile, but real. He arrived at her apartment one evening, unannounced but not uninvited, standing in the doorway like he had a right to be there, which, in a way, he did. Marco had fallen asleep hours ago, exhausted from school and play, and she studied him in silence, noting the faint tremor in his hands, the tight line of his jaw, the weight he carried in his shoulders. For a man who had ruled empires, he seemed unbearably human in this space, unbearably vulnerable when it came to them. You can't keep hiding from me, she said finally, voice low but firm. Not anymore. Whatever you are, whatever you've done, I see it, and I see you. We can't live in half-truths. He studied her, eyes sharp, calculating, then softened. There are things you don't know, he said. Things I've done, things I can't undo. I don't care, she whispered, stepping closer. Not everything, not you. His gaze flicked to her face, searching, measuring. For a long moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, she understood the weight of his world, the lives he had shaped, the blood on his hands, the enemies who would never forgive. But she also saw something else: regret. A deep, gnawing remorse that made the hard edges of his life jagged with pain. I've made choices, he said finally, voice low, almost confessing to himself. Choices I'd take back if I could. But some things you can't undo. You just try to survive them. She reached out, resting a hand on his chest, feeling the slow, steady thrum of his heartbeat beneath her palm. You survived, she said softly. And somehow I survived you being you. That has to mean something, doesn't it? He swallowed, and the tension in his face eased slightly. It means I've been given a second chance, he admitted, voice low. Not just at life, at something else. Something I thought I lost long ago. And she understood then, in a way that words couldn't capture. That he was speaking not just of himself, but of her, of them. She could feel it in the tremor of his hands, in the quiet desperation in his eyes, in the rare softness that softened the cold edges of his power. But before they could dwell on the fragile intimacy blooming between them, a shadow from his past emerged. One of his old associates, someone who had been loyal once but now felt betrayed, appeared at her workplace. The man's eyes were hard, filled with resentment, and she felt a cold dread settle in her chest the moment she recognized the threat. "Who's that?" she asked, heart pounding. He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. "Someone from a past I can't ignore," he said finally. "Someone who might put you in danger if I don't act." That night, he arrived at her apartment once again, urgency sharp in every movement. He explained the situation briefly, the tension between clarity and concealment perfectly balanced. She listened, heart hammering, realizing just how inescapable his world had become for them both. "You can't run from this," he said, eyes dark, intense. "Not if you want to be with me. Not if you want us." Her chest tightened. "I don't know if I can, if I should." "You can," he interrupted, voice softer now, almost a plea. "Because you're already part of my life, whether you realize it or not. And I won't let you go. Not again." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. She looked into his eyes and realized that fear, desire, love, and danger were all tangled together in a way that made walking away impossible. She wanted to run, yes, from the danger, from the uncertainty, from the past he carried. But she also wanted to stay, to fight alongside him, to trust him with everything she had, even if it destroyed them both. And so she made a choice. Tentative, fragile, dangerous, but a choice nonetheless. "I trust you," she whispered. "All of you, even the parts that scare me." He closed the distance between them, hand cupping her cheek, thumb brushing against her skin in a gesture so intimate it made her breath catch. "And I'll protect you," he said, voice low, steady, unflinching. "Every day, every moment, until the end of my life, I swear it." For the first time, the weight of his world didn't feel entirely suffocating. She felt it pressing close. Yes, but intertwined with something far more powerful, connection. Love. The fragile thread that had begun in the sterile hospital room now pulsed between them, unbroken and alive, even amidst the chaos that surrounded them. But danger never rests. That night, as they held each other in the quiet of her apartment, both aware of the precariousness of their situation, the city outside whispered reminders of the storm yet to come. Enemies would strike. Secrets would surface, and their fragile love would be tested in ways they could never anticipate. Yet, as she rested her head against his chest, listening to the heartbeat she had come to trust more than anything, she knew one undeniable truth: they would face it all together. Because by now, it wasn't just protection or obligation that bound them. It was love, real, complicated, dangerous love, the kind that could save or destroy them both, and they were ready to see which it would be. The night came like a predator, silent and merciless, slipping into the city's veins, while she slept beside Marco, unaware of the danger that had already begun to circle. He had known it was coming, knew the rival faction, the ghosts of his past, and even some of his own reckless decisions would converge tonight. But knowing didn't make it easier. He felt the weight of every choice he'd made, every secret he'd kept, pressing down like a storm threatening to break him. He arrived at her apartment before midnight, the streets slick with rain, footsteps echoing faintly as he moved with the precision of a man, trained to anticipate violence. His heart, usually an untouchable fortress, thudded with a quiet tension he barely acknowledged. He wasn't just protecting himself tonight. He was protecting them, her and Marco, and nothing else mattered. Inside, she stirred, half awake. "Is it happening?" she whispered, voice barely audible. She had been waiting for this night, dreading it, fearing it, but also unable to imagine life without him. "Yes," he said softly, stepping closer, eyes scanning every shadow. "But I'll keep you safe. I promise." Her hand found his, tentative but firm. And in that simple touch, he felt an anchor, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Not power, not fear, not loyalty, but them. The first wave of attackers hit just after midnight. Gunshots rang out in the alley below, shattering the calm and sending vibrations through the walls. She instinctively grabbed Marco, pulling him close, heart hammering. Fear clashed with trust, a volatile mix that made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced. He moved like a shadow through the chaos, weapons drawn, every motion precise and lethal. The men were skilled, but he was faster, smarter, fueled by something more powerful than skill, desperation, and love. Every step he took, every calculated strike was for her and for Marco, and the intensity in his eyes made it clear that failure was not an option. Inside, she watched from the window, stomach twisting, unable to do anything but pray. She hated that she couldn't help him. She hated the helplessness. But she also hated the thrill, the impossible thrill of watching a man had once been untouchable reveal a side that was devoted entirely to her. Hours passed in a blur of gunfire, shouts, and controlled chaos. By the time the city's sirens faded into the distance, the attackers were gone, neutralized, retreating, leaving nothing but the echo of their presence, and he returned, rain-soaked, bruised but alive, stepping into her apartment with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, rushing to him. Her hands moved over his arms, shoulders, scanning for damage, though she already knew he was more battered in ways she couldn't see. The mental strain, the pressure, the weight of responsibility. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, voice low but strained. His eyes softened when they found hers. "But you scared me." She clutched his coat, pulling him close. "I was scared too," she admitted, voice trembling. "But I knew you'd come back to us." The moment stretched, charged with relief, fear, and something deeper, something neither had admitted fully until now. And as they stood there, holding each other, she realized the truth she had been avoiding. She loved him completely, without reservation, even with all the danger his world carried. I can't do this without you," he whispered, voice breaking the usual armor of control. "You have to know, I would die to keep you safe. I would die for him," he added, glancing at Marco, "and I would die for you." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they weren't just fear. They were gratitude, love, and relief. "You don't have to," she said softly, "because you won't have to. We'll face it together. You, me, and Marco." He pulled her into his arms, resting his forehead against hers. "Together," he repeated, the word carrying a weight far heavier than either of them could have imagined. It wasn't just a promise. It was a declaration, a vow, a lifeline. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded within a single apartment. But inside, the three of them, him, her, and Marco, had carved a space of safety, of love, of fragile hope. They had survived the night, and in doing so, had proven something essential. No matter how dangerous the world outside, together they were stronger. And in that quiet aftermath, the first real smiles began to emerge. Marco laughed softly, tugging at his hand, and she watched him, heart full, realizing that life, despite its chaos, could still hold moments of beauty. He looked at her then, eyes dark and intense, yet soft in a way he reserved only for her. "I almost lost you tonight," he admitted. "And I won't ever let that happen again." "I know," she whispered, pressing a hand to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "And I won't let you go either." For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe not in power, not in fear, but in something far more dangerous and rewarding, love. And she allowed herself to hope that even a man like him, a mafia boss hardened by life, loss, could choose a future that included her, Marco, and a chance at something real, because some bonds, forged in chaos and danger, were stronger than anything else in the world. The morning after the attack was quiet, almost impossibly so. The city hummed in its usual rhythm, but inside their small apartment, a fragile peace had settled. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in his hands, eyes dark but soft, watching her move around the room as she prepared breakfast for Marco. There was no grandeur here, no orders or fear, just the small, intimate moment of ordinary life that he had long ago stopped believing he could ever have. Marco bounded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, still half asleep, but full of the boundless energy that only children have. "Dad?" he asked cautiously, blinking at the man who had stepped into their lives like a shadow turned light. He looked at the boy, then at her, and something inside him shifted, a rare, unguarded warmth breaking through decades of armor. "Good morning, Marco," he said, voice steady but kind. "Did you sleep well?" "Yeah," Marco said, a shy smile forming. "Mom said you saved us last night." He swallowed, the weight of it heavy in his chest. "I did," he admitted, "and I'd do it 1,000 times over." She watched the exchange, heart swelling with a mix of relief and love. These quiet, imperfect moments were the life she had longed for, even when danger had been a constant shadow. And she saw in him, not just the Mafia boss, not just the dangerous man who haunted the streets, but the protector, the father figure, the man who had been softened by love in ways she hadn't thought possible. "Breakfast ready," she said gently, gesturing toward the table. The ordinary task felt monumental, a first step toward normalcy in a life that had been anything but. They ate together, tentative smiles, small laughter, the kind that fills a home with warmth rather than fear. And for the first time, he allowed himself to breathe not the shallow, controlled breath of a man always ready for combat, but a deep, steady exhale that acknowledged the life he could have with them. Later that day, they walked through the city together, Marco skipping ahead, hand in hers. He followed, not intrusively, but close enough that she could feel his presence, a silent promise that he would be there. Always. They stopped at a small park, sunlight catching his hair, and he knelt beside Marco, tossing a ball back and forth. Her heart tightened at the sight. A man who had lived with violence and betrayal, now finding joy in something as simple and pure as a child's laughter. She approached him slowly, brushing her hand along his arm. "You really could have walked away," she said quietly, voice filled with awe and emotion. "You didn't have to stay." He looked at her then, eyes locking with hers, intense and unflinching. "I couldn't," he said simply, "because leaving would mean losing you, losing him. And I won't ever do that." The words hit her harder than any confession she had ever heard. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to wrap herself around him, and never let go. Instead, she let the silence stretch, savoring the unspoken understanding between them. They had survived chaos, attacks, fear, and secrets, yet here they were alive, together and stronger for it. Weeks passed. The threats from his past dwindled, either neutralized or moved beyond reach, leaving them space to build something fragile but real. He continued his work, yes, but it no longer defined every second of his existence. There were moments of danger, reminders that his life could never be entirely safe. Alongside those moments came love, trust, and family. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city skyline, he took her hand, leading her to a quiet rooftop. Marco was asleep, dreaming peacefully, and for once, the weight of the world felt manageable. "I never imagined this life," he admitted, voice low, almost vulnerable. I thought love like this wasn't for me. I thought I'd always be alone, surrounded by shadows." "You're not alone anymore," she said, voice soft, tears glinting in her eyes. "We're here, all of us, and you don't have to face anything alone." He pulled her close, forehead resting against hers. "I love you," he whispered, "more than anything. And I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you, Marco, and we survive this together." She smiled, heart full, a weight lifting she hadn't realized she carried for decades. "I love you too," she said. "And we will, together." They stayed there, holding each other as the sun set, the city alive beneath them. The world outside remained dangerous, unpredictable, and often cruel. But inside this fragile bubble, they had found something permanent: trust, love, family. And in that moment, he was no longer just a Mafia boss, and she was no longer just a nurse struggling to survive. They were a family, forged in fire and danger, tempered by pain and fear, and strengthened by the unshakable bond of love. The city could rage, enemies could linger, and chaos could always find them, but nothing could break what they had built together, because they had survived the impossible, and they had chosen each other, and that choice, they both knew, was stronger than anything else in the world. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more cinematic Mafia love stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt tales of love, danger, and redemption.